They thought her silence was surrender. They thought the quiet black woman with the injured child had already lost. For hours, Lynda Williams sat in that tense courtroom while her billionaire ex-husband Erwin Carper and his attack dog lawyers shredded her character with calculated cruelty. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She just listened. Everyone, the gallery, the whispers, even the court reporter, assumed the verdict was already written. But they didn't understand that Lynda wasn't silent because she had nothing to say. She was silent because she was documenting every lie, every inconsistency, every arrogant word that would later become evidence. When Judge Morrison finally asked the question no one saw coming, Lynda's answer didn't just win custody, it triggered a criminal investigation. You won't believe what she had been quietly preparing. The overhead fluorescent lights in courtroom 7C hummed with an artificial brightness that made everything feel overexposed and merciless. The polished wood panels seemed to absorb sound, creating a suffocating quiet punctuated only by Erwin's sharp, accusatory voice. Erwin Carper straightened his Tom Ford tie, his movements deliberate and performative. He didn't carry himself like a man defending his parenting. He carried himself like a man reminding everyone in the room that he could buy and sell them twice over before lunch. At 48, Erwin was a self-made billionaire whose name appeared on hospital wings and tech conference keynotes. A man whose charitable donations were as strategic as his offshore accounts. Seated beside him was his lead attorney, Marcus Weiland, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. Weiland didn't just win custody cases. He dismantled mothers until judges questioned whether they'd ever been competent at all. And in the row behind them sat Erwin's PR team, two women with matching blazers and tablets, already drafting the press release about his devoted fatherhood. On the opposite side sat Lynda. She wore a navy blazer that had been tailored once, years ago, before the divorce drained her savings. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, understated style. She looked composed, not in the defiant way that invites confrontation, but in the unsettling way of someone who has already made peace with what's coming. Her right hand rested gently on her son's shoulder. The boy, barely 10 years old, sat beside her with his arm in a sling. His face streaked with silent tears he was trying desperately to hide. "Miss Williams," Judge Morrison said, glancing up from the file before her. The judge was a sharp woman in her mid-50s, known for running an efficient courtroom with little tolerance for grandstanding. Yet even she seemed weary from the week's proceedings. "Your counsel may present any final statements regarding the custody arrangement." Lynda's attorney, a young public defender named Aaron Chen, rose slowly. He looked like he was about to apologize for wasting everyone's time. Erwin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth, and Lynda said nothing. She simply placed a plain manila folder on the table in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on its edge, and waited. Aaron Chen cleared his throat, shuffling papers that suddenly felt too loud in the quiet courtroom. Before he could speak, Erwin Carper shot to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may," Judge Morrison's eyebrow arched. "Mr. Carper, you'll have your opportunity through counsel." "With respect, Your Honor, I think the court needs to hear directly from someone who actually cares about these children's welfare." Erwin's voice carried that particular blend of wounded righteousness and barely controlled fury that had served him well in boardrooms. "I've sat here for 3 days, listening to deflections and excuses, and I won't stay silent while my son suffers." Marcus Weiland placed a hand on Erwin's arm, a gesture meant to appear restraining, but performed with all the authenticity of a rehearsed play. "Your Honor, my client is understandably emotional given the circumstances. Mr. Weiland, control your client or I'll hold him in contempt." But Erwin was already moving, stepping away from the table, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He turned, and his finger rose like an accusation made flesh, pointing directly across the aisle at Lynda. "Look at her. Just look at her." His voice cracked with manufactured pain. "That is the woman who was supposed to protect our children. That is the woman who let our son break his arm because she was too distracted, too overwhelmed, too fundamentally incapable of providing basic supervision." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Someone in the gallery shifted, the wooden bench creaking. Lynda didn't move. Her hand remained steady on her son's shoulder. Her eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, as though she were watching something no one else could see. She sits there like a statue, Erwin continued, his voice rising, like she's above all this, like she doesn't need to explain how a 10-year-old boy ends up in the emergency room on her watch. Like silence is somehow dignity instead of what it really is, an admission that she has no defense. Aaron started to object, but Erwin rolled over him. I have built schools, Your Honor. I have funded medical research. I have created opportunities for thousands of people, and I have done it while being an active, present father to my children. And what has she done? He gestured dismissively. She sits there month after month, bringing our son to court in that sling, like some kind of prop, using his pain to generate sympathy she hasn't earned. The boy flinched. Lynda's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his shoulder. Judge Morrison's voice cut through like a blade. Mr. Carper, sit down. Now. But the damage was done. Erwin had owned the room, filled it with his presence, his pain, his power. He returned to his seat with the satisfied air of a man who had just delivered a closing argument. Marcus Weiland whispered something in his ear. Erwin nodded, composing his expression into something that resembled paternal concern. Behind them, phones were already being angled subtly toward the gallery. Someone would leak this. By evening, there would be headlines: billionaire father's emotional plea, or tech mogul fights for son's safety. Judge Morrison turned her attention to Lynda. Miss Williams, do you have anything you'd like to say in response to these allegations? The courtroom waited. Lynda met the judge's eyes for the first time all morning. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. Not yet, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even Aaron looked confused, uncertain whether to intervene. Erwin's smirk returned, small and victorious. Lynda said nothing else. She simply opened the manila folder on the table in front of her, glanced down at whatever was inside, and then closed it again. Her expression betrayed nothing. No anger, no fear, no desperation, just patience, and the terrible, unsettling calm of someone who knew exactly what came next. The boy's name was Julian, though no one in the courtroom had bothered to use it. To Erwin's legal team, he was the minor child or the victim of maternal negligence. To the gallery, he was a symbol, proof that even billionaires could suffer, that wealth couldn't protect you from the failures of an inadequate ex-wife. He sat rigid in the chair beside his mother, his small frame dwarfed by the formal proceedings around him. The sling cradling his left arm was stark white against his grey sweater, impossible to ignore. Every few minutes he would shift slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at something painful, and fresh tears would well up in his eyes. He tried to blink them away, tried to be strong the way 10-year-old boys think they need to be, but they came anyway. Silent, humiliating, visible to everyone. Marcus Weiland had made sure of that. During his opening statement 3 days ago, he'd positioned Julian directly in the judge's sightline, angled so that every tear, every tremor, every moment of childish distress became part of the record. He'd requested, with practiced concern, that Julian be present for proceedings, so the court can see firsthand the impact of this custodial arrangement on the child's well-being. What he meant was, so everyone could see the crying boy with the broken arm sitting next to the silent mother who let it happen. A woman in the second row leaned toward her companion, whispering behind her hand. Her eyes lingered on Julian with that particular blend of pity and judgment that people reserve for situations they believe they would have handled better. The companion nodded, glancing at Lynda with undisguised disapproval. Erwin had told the story 5 times now, once to the press outside, twice in depositions and twice in open court. Each telling had been refined, polished, weaponized. Julian had been at Lynda's apartment, playing in the living room while she was distracted by her phone, or in another room, or simply not paying attention. The details shifted slightly depending on which version played best. He'd climbed onto a chair, reached for something on a high shelf, and fallen. The arm had broken in 2 places. Lynda had waited 30 minutes before calling for help, too panicked to think clearly, too overwhelmed to function in a crisis. A child, Weiland had said during his opening, is only as safe as the adult responsible for him, and this child, he gestured to Julian, is clearly not safe. What no one mentioned was that Julian hadn't said a word about what happened, not in court, not in the custody evaluator's office, not even in the carefully orchestrated conversation Erwin's team had tried to facilitate. When asked direct questions, he would glance at his mother, then at his father, and then down at his lap, his silence somehow more damning than any accusation. Now, as the morning stretched on, Julian's composure finally cracked. A tear rolled down his cheek, followed by another. His right hand, the uninjured one, came up to wipe at his face, but it was too late. The court reporter glanced over. Judge Morrison's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Erwin saw it too. He leaned toward Weiland, whispering something urgent. Weiland nodded and stood. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but as the court can clearly see, this proceeding is causing significant distress to the child. My client has consistently maintained that his primary concern is his son's emotional and physical safety. Watching his mother sit there, unresponsive, offering no explanation, no accountability, no maternal comfort, it's re-traumatizing him." Julian's shoulders began to shake. He pressed his face against his mother's sleeve, trying to hide. Linda's hand moved from his shoulder to the back of his head, her fingers gentle against his hair. She leaned down, whispering something no one else could hear. Julian nodded against her arm but didn't look up. "Miss Williams," Judge Morrison said, her tone softer now, "would your son be more comfortable waiting outside?" Lynda looked up, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face, not weakness, but recognition. They were using her child's pain as evidence against her. And the more she comforted him, the more it would be framed as guilt. "He stays with me," she said quietly. The whispers started during the afternoon session, low and insidious, spreading through the gallery like smoke through ventilation. She hasn't said anything. Not once, not a single explanation. If my child was sitting there crying, I'd be, exactly. Any real mother would be. They didn't finish the sentences. They didn't need to. The implications hung in the air, heavy and damning. A real mother would be emotional. A real mother would be defending herself. A real mother would be doing something other than sitting there with that unsettling, unreadable calm. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, and the exodus began. People filed out into the hallway, phones emerging from pockets before they'd even cleared the doorway. The court stenographer stretched her fingers. The bailiff checked his watch. Erwin stood, buttoning his jacket, accepting a bottle of mineral water from one of his assistants with the ease of a man accustomed to having his needs anticipated. Lynda remained seated. Aaron Chen leaned toward her, his voice urgent and low. "Lynda, we need to put you on the stand. We need you to tell your side. The judge is... People are starting to think..." "I know what they think," Lynda said. "Then help me here. Give me something to work with. An explanation. Context. Anything." He rubbed his temple, exhaustion bleeding into frustration. Because right now, their narrative is the only one in the room. And silence isn't a strategy. It's suicide. Lynda's gaze moved to Julian, who had finally stopped crying but sat hunched over, drawing invisible patterns on the table with his good hand. "Not yet," she said. Aaron sat back, defeated. He'd been appointed to this case 3 weeks ago, handed a file thick with depositions and financial records that painted his client as negligent at best, dangerously incompetent at worst. She'd refused to let him put up a fight. Every suggestion had been met with the same response. Not yet. He was beginning to wonder if she'd simply given up. Across the aisle, Marcus Weiland was holding court with 2 journalists who'd been covering the trial. He spoke in that careful way attorneys do when they're not technically supposed to be talking to the press, but absolutely are. "Look, I can't comment on ongoing proceedings, but I will say that actions speak louder than words. Or in this case, the absence of words speaks volumes." One of the journalists glanced over at Lynda, notebook already open. The headline was writing itself. In the bathroom, 2 women from the gallery stood at adjacent sinks, their conversation reflected in the mirror. "I mean, I get that divorce is hard, but that's her child. You'd think she'd at least try to explain. Maybe she can't. Maybe there is no explanation. That's what I'm saying. Maybe all those things he's saying about her are true." They didn't know Lynda was in the stall behind them, waiting for them to leave, listening to herself being convicted in real time. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. Before there had been uncertainty, the possibility that evidence might yet emerge to complicate the narrative. Now there was something closer to consensus. The gallery had made up its mind. Even the court reporter's expression had hardened into something resembling pity, not for Lynda, but for the child sitting beside her. Marcus Weiland stood to call his next witness. an expert in child development who would testify about the psychological impact of parental neglect. As he approached the bench with his credentials, he allowed himself a brief glance back at Lynda. She was writing something in a small notebook, her handwriting precise and unhurried. She looked, he thought, like a woman taking notes on someone else's trial. Detached, disengaged, already defeated. He smiled. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was that Lynda wasn't taking notes on the proceedings. She was recording them. Date, time, exact wording. Every lie that Erwin had told, every inconsistency in his timeline, every claim that would later need to be cross-referenced with evidence no one knew existed yet. She turned the page and continued writing, her silence absolute, her purpose unwavering. Judge Morrison had presided over family court for 17 years, and in that time she'd developed an instinct for inconsistency. It wasn't always obvious, not dramatic contradictions or smoking guns, but small discrepancies that accumulated like sediment, eventually revealing patterns beneath the surface. She'd noticed the first one on day 2, when Erwin testified about his schedule. He'd claimed to have dinner with his children at least 4 nights a week, but the custody evaluator's report documented something closer to twice a month. When pressed, he'd smoothly pivoted to video calls and weekend visits, his attorney nodding along as though the distinction was irrelevant. The second inconsistency emerged during the expert testimony. Dr. Patricia Henning, a child psychologist retained by Erwin's team, had spoken at length about the importance of stability and routine in a child's life. She'd described Julian as demonstrating clear signs of anxiety and insecurity during her evaluation sessions. But when Judge Morrison had asked which parent Julian had specifically requested to see after the sessions, Dr. Henning had hesitated before answering that he'd asked for his mother. Now, as Marcus Weiland questioned his final witness, a neighbor from Lynda's apartment building, a third inconsistency was emerging, and this one had teeth. "And you heard raised voices coming from Miss Williams's apartment on the evening of March 15th? Weiland asked. "Yes, I did," the neighbor said, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an eagerness to be helpful. Quite loud. It sounded like an argument. "And did you recognize the voices?" "Well, I recognized Miss Williams, of course. And there was a child crying." Weiland nodded gravely. "The same evening, we should note, that Julian sustained his injury." Judge Morrison glanced down at the incident report in front of her. The date was marked clearly, March 15th. But something else was marked there too, a detail she'd noted earlier and nearly forgotten. She flipped back through her file, found the emergency room intake form, and read the timestamp. "Mr. Weiland," she interrupted. "What time did this neighbor hear the alleged argument?" The neighbor answered before Weiland could. "Around 7:30 in the evening, Your Honor. I remember because I was watching the news. And the ER report indicates Julian was admitted at 4:45 that same afternoon." Judge Morrison looked up, her reading glasses catching the light. 3 hours earlier. The courtroom went still. Weiland recovered quickly. "Your Honor, the timeline of the argument isn't necessarily connected to the injury itself. The point is the pattern of—" "The point, Mr. Weiland, is that your witness is testifying about an argument that allegedly occurred after the child was already in the hospital." Her voice was measured but sharp, which raises questions about what he actually heard, when he heard it, or whether it's relevant to these proceedings at all. If you're following this story and want to see how everything Lynda has been quietly documenting finally comes to light, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think the judge is starting to see through Erwin's performance, and hit that like button if you're rooting for Lynda. Trust me, what's coming in the next chapter will make this whole trial worth it. Erwin shifted in his seat, the movement subtle but unmistakable. Marcus Weiland began to respond, but Judge Morrison raised a hand. "I'd like to move on," she said. "Miss Williams, I notice you've been taking notes throughout these proceedings." Lynda looked up, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "Yes, Your Honor." "May I ask what you're documenting?" Aaron Chen started to stand, unsure whether to object or assist, but Lynda's voice came clear and steady. "Inconsistencies, Your Honor." A beat of silence followed. Then another. Judge Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted, a recalibration of attention, a reorienting of focus. For the first time in 3 days, people weren't looking at Julian's sling or Erwin's expensive suit. They were looking at Lynda's notebook. Inconsistencies, Judge Morrison repeated slowly. In the testimony? Among other things. Erwin leaned toward Weiland, whispering urgently. Weiland's jaw tightened. Judge Morrison removed her glasses. I think we need to hear more about that. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her hands folded on the bench. The afternoon light slanting through the courtroom windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the polished wood. Everything felt suddenly fragile, as though the slightest sound might shatter whatever was about to happen. Miss Williams, the judge said, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer. Lynda closed her notebook, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Beside her, Aaron Chen sat frozen, afraid to breathe, afraid to break whatever spell was forming. Erwin's smirk had faded. He watched Lynda with the focused intensity of a man who'd just realized the game might not be over. On March 15th, Judge Morrison continued, the date of your son's injury, where was Mr. Carper? The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus Weiland rose halfway out of his chair. Your Honor, I'm not sure how my client's whereabouts are relevant to— Sit down, Mr. Weiland. The judge's tone left no room for argument. Miss Williams, please answer the question. Lynda's voice was quiet but carried perfectly in the silent courtroom. He was at my apartment, Your Honor. The gallery erupted in whispers. Someone's phone clattered against the wooden bench. The court reporter's fingers paused over her stenotype machine. He was present when the injury occurred? Judge Morrison asked. Yes, Your Honor. Erwin shot to his feet. That's a lie. I wasn't anywhere near— Mr. Carper, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Judge Morrison's voice could have cut glass. She turned back to Lynda. Miss Williams, this is a serious claim. Do you have evidence to support it? Lynda opened the manila folder on the table in front of her. She removed a single document and handed it to Aaron, who stared at it for 3 full seconds before passing it to the bailiff with shaking hands. Security footage from my building's entrance, Your Honor. Time-stamped at 3:47 p.m. on March 15th. Mr. Carper entered the building at that time. Judge Morrison accepted the document, her eyes scanning the pages. The silence stretched so long it became painful. Your Honor, Weiland tried again, his voice strained. Even if my client was present for a brief visit, that doesn't change the fact that— Mr. Weiland, I'm going to ask you to stop talking. Judge Morrison looked up from the document. Miss Williams, the medical report indicates your son's injury was consistent with a fall. Is that your understanding? No, Your Honor. The room seemed to contract. Then, what is your understanding of how the injury occurred? Lynda's hand rested gently on Julian's shoulder. The boy had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Julian didn't fall, Your Honor. His father grabbed his arm during an argument and twisted it, hard enough to fracture it in 2 places. Erwin's face drained of color. That is absolutely— There's a second medical report. Lynda continued, her voice steady. From Dr. Sarah Chen at Children's Hospital. I took Julian there the following week for a second opinion, because the fracture pattern didn't match the explanation I'd been told to give. Doctor. Dr. Chen's assessment indicates the injury is consistent with forceful twisting, not a fall. The report also notes bruising on Julian's upper arm, consistent with grip marks. She removed another document from her folder, then another. I also have text messages from Mr. Carper on March 14th demanding to see Julian outside our custody arrangement. Voice messages from that same evening when I refused, and a recording from my phone, which was in my pocket during the incident on March 15th, in which Mr. Carper can be heard yelling at Julian to stop being weak moments before my son started screaming. The manila folder was open now, revealing a stack of documents easily 2 inches thick. Photographs, time-stamped emails, bank statements, medical records, years of documentation. Marcus Weiland had gone pale. Erwin sat rigid, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. Miss Williams, are you telling this court that Mr. Carper caused your son's injury and that you've been allowing him to blame you for it? Lynda met the judge's eyes. Yes, Your Honor. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Lynda stood, and the simple act of rising seemed to command the room in a way that 3 days of silence hadn't prepared anyone for. She wasn't tall, wasn't imposing in any conventional sense, but something in her bearing, the straight line of her spine, the steadiness of her hands, made everyone lean forward. Aaron Chen looked up at her, bewildered, as though his client had just transformed into someone he'd never met. "Your Honor," Lynda said, "may I approach?" Judge Morrison gestured toward the bench. "Please." Lynda gathered her folder and walked forward, her footsteps measured and deliberate. She didn't glance at Erwin as she passed his table, though she could feel his stare burning into her back. When she reached the bench, she laid out the documents one by one, narrating as she went. Security footage from March 15th showing Mr. Carper's arrival at 3:47 p.m. and departure at 4:32, 13 minutes before I called 911. Dr. Sarah Chen's independent medical assessment dated March 22nd, including photographs of the bruising that was still visible a week after the incident. The original ER report, which I was pressured by Mr. Carper to give as a fall because he threatened to make sure I never saw my children again if I told the truth. Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise or fall with emotion. She delivered each piece of evidence like a prosecutor laying out an indictment. Text messages from Mr. Carper on March 14th through 16th, including one sent at 11 p.m. On the 15th that reads, "If you tell anyone what really happened, I will bury you. I will take everything. No one will believe you anyway." She slid the phone records across the bench, voice messages from that same period which I've preserved, and the audio recording from my phone, which captured approximately 4 minutes of the incident, including Mr. Carper shouting at Julian, Julian crying, and the moment my son screamed when his arm was injured. Judge Morrison's expression had moved past surprise into something colder, sharper. She examined each document with meticulous attention, cross-referencing timestamps and details. Marcus Weiland finally found his voice. "Your Honor, these materials haven't been disclosed through proper discovery channels. This is ambush evidence, and it's inadmissible." "Mr. Weiland," Judge Morrison said without looking up, "I suggest you save your objections until I've reviewed what's been presented." Lynda continued, "There are also financial records showing that Mr. Carper has been systematically hiding assets in offshore accounts under shell companies. Bank statements that contradict his sworn testimony regarding his income and support payments, and email correspondence between Mr. Carper and his business manager discussing how to minimize exposure during the divorce proceedings." She laid out another set of documents, spreadsheets, account summaries, emails with subject lines like "Re-Asset Protection Strategy" and "Cayman Transfer, Urgent." Everything Mr. Carper has testified to regarding his financial transparency, his cooperative co-parenting, his concern for his children's welfare, it's documented lies, Your Honor. All of it. Erwin was on his feet now, his composure finally shattered. "She's been planning this. She's been sitting there for 3 days letting me. This is entrapment. This is—" "Mr. Carper, sit down." Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your Honor, she let me testify knowing she had all of this. She let me—" "Yes, Mr. Carper, she did. And now I'm very interested in why she felt the need to document everything so thoroughly. Miss Williams, why didn't you present any of this evidence through your attorney during normal proceedings?" Lynda's answer was simple, devastating in its clarity. "Because I needed him to commit perjury first, Your Honor. I needed every lie on the record under oath, so there would be no question about his credibility when the truth came out. I needed him to feel confident enough to keep talking." She glanced back at Erwin for the first time, and he did. The courtroom had gone so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like thunder. Judge Morrison set down the last document and removed her glasses. "Mr. Weiland, I'm going to ask you a question, and you have about 10 seconds to decide whether you want to continue representing your client." Marcus Weiland's hand moved to his briefcase, an instinctive gesture of a man calculating his exit strategy. He stood slowly, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes had gone hard and distant, the look of an attorney realizing he'd just been made complicit in something criminal. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to consult with my client." "Request denied." Judge Morrison's tone was ice. "Sit down, Mr. Weiland. You're going to want to hear this." Erwin wasn't sitting. He'd moved away from the table, pacing in the small space between his chair and the gallery railing, his hands running through his hair. The polished billionaire who'd entered the courtroom that morning had vanished, replaced by something raw and desperate. "This is insane. This is—" She's manipulating the situation. She's twisting everything to make me look. He spun toward Judge Morrison. Your Honor, you can't possibly believe that I would hurt my own son. That recording could be doctored. Those documents could be fabricated. She's had 3 days to sit there and plan this character assassination. Mr. Carper, I'm going to say this one final time. Sit down. But Erwin was spiraling now, the control he'd maintained for years cracking apart in real time. She's done nothing but sit there and take notes like some kind of stalker, documenting everything, waiting for her moment to tell the truth. Judge Morrison's voice cut through his rambling like a scalpel. Is that what you were about to say? Erwin's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Weiland, who was staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. He looked at the gallery, where faces that had been sympathetic an hour ago now watched him with suspicion and dawning horror. He looked at the PR team in the back row, already gathering their things. I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment right, Erwin said suddenly. The courtroom erupted. Whispers became murmurs, became outright conversation. The journalists in the back row were typing frantically on their phones, no longer bothering to hide it. Judge Morrison slammed her gavel once, the crack of it silencing the room. This is a civil custody proceeding, Mr. Carper. You don't have Fifth Amendment protections here. However, given what's been presented, I am suspending these proceedings and referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Your Honor, Weiland tried one last time, but his heart wasn't in it. I'm not finished, Mr. Weiland. I'm also issuing an immediate emergency custody order. Full custody of Julian and his sister is granted to Miss Williams effective immediately. Mr. Carper, you are prohibited from any contact with your children pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Erwin grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. His face had gone from red to white, his breathing shallow and rapid. You can't do this. I have rights. You have the right to retain new counsel, Judge Morrison said, because I'm also ordering a forensic audit of your financial disclosures to this court. If even half of what Miss Williams has documented is accurate, you've committed perjury, obstruction, and fraud. The court will also be reviewing whether Mr. Weiland or anyone else on your legal team had knowledge of these misrepresentations. Weiland stood abruptly. Your Honor, I can assure you that I had no knowledge. Then you should be very grateful that Miss Williams documented everything so thoroughly, because that timeline may be the only thing that keeps you from losing your license. Judge Morrison gathered the documents in front of her. Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Carper remains in the courthouse. The DA's office will likely want to speak with him before he leaves. The bailiff moved toward Erwin, who backed away as though he'd been threatened. This isn't over, Erwin said, his voice cracking. I will appeal this. I will fight this. I have resources you can't even— Mr. Carper, Judge Morrison interrupted. I suggest you stop talking. Everything you say right now is being recorded, and I suspect you've already said far more than your next attorney will be comfortable with. Erwin looked around the courtroom wildly, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, anyone who still believed his version of events. He found none. Judge Morrison signed the emergency custody order with swift, decisive strokes, each signature a reversal of everything Erwin had assumed would happen. She handed the documents to the bailiff, then turned her attention back to Lynda, who had returned to her seat beside Julian. Miss Williams, I want to be very clear about what's happening here. As of this moment, you have sole legal and physical custody of both your children. Mr. Carper is prohibited from direct or indirect contact with Julian and his sister until further order of this court. That includes phone calls, messages, third-party communications, and appearances at their school or extracurricular activities. Julian's head came up slowly. He looked at his mother, confusion, and something else, something that might have been relief, flickering across his young face. Your Honor, Aaron Chen said, rising with the tentative energy of a man who still couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. What about the previous temporary custody arrangement? Mr. Carper currently has the children's passports and has been exercising weekend visitation. The passports are to be surrendered to Miss Williams's attorney within 24 hours. If they are not produced, I'll issue a warrant. Judge Morrison looked directly at Erwin, who stood frozen near the gallery railing, his expensive suit suddenly seeming ill-fitting, like a costume he'd borrowed. Mr. Carper, I'm also freezing all joint accounts and any accounts in the children's names pending the forensic audit. You will not transfer, liquidate, or otherwise dispose of any assets until this court determines the full extent of your financial misrepresentations. You can't freeze my accounts, Erwin said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. He sounded like a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. Those are business assets. I have payroll, obligations, investors. Then I suggest you retain a very good attorney who can explain to those investors why their money may have been routed through offshore accounts you swore under oath didn't exist. Judge Morrison's expression was carved from stone. Bailiff, please provide Mr. Carper with the contact information for the district attorney's office. I expect they'll want to speak with him before the end of business today. Marcus Wyland had already packed his briefcase. He stood, his voice carefully measured. Your Honor, I'm formally withdrawing as counsel for Mr. Carper, effective immediately. I'll be filing the appropriate motions by end of day. Erwin turned on him, desperation bleeding into rage. You can't just abandon. We had an agreement. We had an attorney-client relationship based on information you provided to me, which now appears to have been materially false. Wyland's tone was professional, but cold. I can't represent a client I don't trust, and I won't put my practice at risk for yours. You need a criminal defense attorney, Erwin, not a family law specialist. He walked out without looking back, his assistant scrambling to follow. The gallery had transformed. The people who'd whispered about Lynda's silence, who'd judged her stillness as weakness, now watched with something approaching awe. A woman in the third row who'd been shaking her head at Lynda earlier now had tears in her eyes. One of the journalists was typing so fast his thumbs were a blur. Judge Morrison turned to Lynda one final time. Miss Williams, I owe you an apology. This court allowed you to be maligned and attacked for 3 days while you sat here documenting everything. That took remarkable courage and restraint. Lynda's voice was quiet. I just wanted to protect my children, Your Honor. You did more than that. You've potentially exposed fraud, perjury, and child endangerment. The district attorney's office will be in contact with you, and I suspect you'll be asked to provide testimony. Are you prepared for that? Yes, Your Honor. I've been prepared for a long time. Judge Morrison nodded. Court is adjourned. Miss Williams, take your son home. Lynda stood, gathering her folder, her notebook, and the small collection of documents that had dismantled a billionaire's empire. Julian rose beside her, his uninjured hand reaching for hers. She took it gently, carefully, and for the first time in 3 days, she smiled at him. Let's go get your sister, she said softly. Behind them, Erwin remained standing at the railing, watching them prepare to leave, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent fury. The bailiff moved closer, a subtle reminder that his freedom to leave to do anything was no longer guaranteed. The mahogany doors of courtroom 7C opened with a weight that felt different now, not the suffocating pressure of inevitable defeat, but the solid resistance of a threshold being crossed. Lynda stepped through first, Julian's hand still clasped in hers, and the hallway beyond erupted into controlled chaos. Camera flashes bloomed like lightning. Reporters surged forward, voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions that blurred together into white noise. Aaron Chen positioned himself protectively, trying to create space, but Lynda paused instead of pushing through. She turned, facing the cameras with the same composed stillness she'd maintained inside the courtroom. Julian pressed against her side, and she kept her hand on his shoulder, not hiding him, not using him, just holding him close. Miss Williams, can you comment on, did you know all along that, what made you wait 3 days to... She didn't answer. Not yet. She simply stood there, letting them see her. A woman who'd been silent by choice, not by weakness. A mother who'd protected her child not with rage or spectacle, but with documentation, strategy, and the patience to let truth dismantle lies. After a long moment she spoke. Her voice carried clearly despite the noise. I stayed silent because silence gave me clarity. It gave me time to listen to every contradiction, every lie, every inconsistency, and it gave me the space to document the truth without interference. She paused, her gaze steady on the cameras. My silence was never surrender. It was preparation. Someone shouted another question, but Lynda was already moving, guiding Julian through the crowd toward the exit. Aaron followed, his expression somewhere between pride and shell-shock. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut through the Seattle clouds, painting the courthouse steps in amber light. Lynda stopped at the top of the stairs, looking out at the city sprawling below. She could see the financial district where Erwin's office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower. She could see the hospital where she'd taken Julian twice, once to the ER with a fabricated story, once for the truth. "Mum," Julian said quietly, his voice almost lost in the ambient noise of the city. "Is it really over?" Lynda looked down at her son. His arm was still in the sling, his face still carried the exhaustion of 3 days in court. But something in his eyes had changed. The fear that had lived there, the careful, calculated fear of a child walking on eggshells, had begun to recede. "The hard part is over," she said. "There will be more questions, more legal things to deal with. But you're safe now. Your sister's safe. That's what matters." Julian nodded, then after a moment's hesitation, leaned against her. She wrapped her arm around him carefully, mindful of his injury, and they stood like that while the world moved around them. Aaron descended a few steps, giving them space, but when he turned back, his expression was thoughtful. "Lynda, I have to ask, why didn't you tell me? Any of it? I could have helped you present this from the beginning." Lynda met his eyes. "Because I needed him to commit fully. If we'd shown our hand early, he would have adjusted, found new lies, buried evidence deeper. I needed him to feel untouchable. I needed him to believe his own story so completely that he'd put everything on the record under oath. That's a hell of a risk. Everything about leaving him was a risk." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not bitter. "The difference is, this time I controlled the variables." Behind them, the courthouse doors opened again. Erwin emerged, flanked by 2 men in suits, investigators from the DA's office by the look of them. He was no longer the confident billionaire who'd pointed across the courtroom that morning. He was smaller now, diminished, a man being escorted rather than leading. For just a moment, his eyes found Lynda's across the distance. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply held his gaze with the same steady calm she'd maintained throughout the trial, then turned away and descended the courthouse steps with her son. The last thing the cameras captured was Lynda Williams walking into the golden afternoon light, her hand gentle on her child's shoulder. Her silence finally transformed into something the world could understand. Not weakness, not surrender, but the quietest, most devastating form of strength.